Hello, friends, and welcome to the City of the Immaculata, a channel where we discuss various topics of history and theology. I would ask for you guys to just take the time to hit the like button. It helps me trigger the YouTube algorithm, which gets these videos out to a little bit of a wider audience, anyways. So recently, I had been in a discussion with a friend of mine, Kevin Fernandez. Kevin runs the channel 33 AD, which if you guys are, consuming Catholic content online, and specifically on YouTube, I really recommend you go follow his channel and watch his videos. He puts a lot of, you can tell, you'll tell just by watching one or two videos, he puts a lot of effort, time, and thought into his videos. And he gives what I think is a fair representation of Protestants, which is oftentimes I think lacking in some of the apologetics work out there. So Kevin and I had been discussing just kind of loosely the topic of development of doctrine, and I have recently done on this channel a series of videos on, marriage as a good, marriage as a sacrament, and so we decided it'd be worthwhile to have sort of a wider conversation and to bring it to, a wider audience. So we were hosted by Christian Wagner over at Scholastic Answers, another channel that if you guys aren't following, you should be following. And Christian was, gracious enough to host us. It was presented as a discussion. I'm going to link that video in the description below. And what I'd like to do today, though, is I'm going to be going back over some of the things that we were discussing yesterday, but this is going to be more in the presentation style that I typically present on this channel when it's just me, as opposed to sort of the open-end discussion that we were doing yesterday. And I think, if you watch the video that it was recorded, it went out live last night, and then if you watch this as well, I think you'll have a pretty wide base or a pretty solid foundation of this topic, and a which is admittedly a very complex topic. And I had some points I wanted to make that we just didn't have time for, and it just ended up not being pertinent to the way that the discussion went. These things happen. I think what we were able to present was very good. There was a few, when you're speaking off the cuff like that, I'm left-handed. I tend to be a little bit dyslexic sometimes, and especially I was just kind of tired last night. So there was a few things, like I'm pretty sure, like in hindsight, that I said that something kind of silly like Saint Cyril in the first century when, Saint Cyril was several centuries later than the first century. So hopefully I will avoid those in this presentation, but regardless, it was a good discussion. Christian was very kind for hosting it, and I think Kevin and I, we kind of we made a good presentation with the points that we brought up. And so like I said, I'm going to spend a little bit more time with the points that I wanted to make. And so without further ado, we're going to start by reviewing the development of doctrine. I think dogmatic theology is necessary for anyone who wants to trace the development of doctrine down through the centuries to, one, avoid resuscitating old heresies, which, Christians seem ever prone to do, but also to keep a doctrine which has been going through this process from becoming corrupted, as well just having the ability to assess a doctrine that the church has declared infallible. And this is an area that I think that apologists, they should have a keen interest in. So dogmatic theology then provides the guardrails within which theologians are safe to speculate and to navigate the oft messy historical record. And within this umbrella discipline is the study of development of doctrine, of which there are numerous methods. And among the two that I really utilize in my own study, first, I would say, is that of St. Vincent of Lérins in his Commentatori. So, St. Vincent of Lérins famously said that authentic development is that which was believed everywhere, always, by all. But to give the full context of this quote, which he lays out, his example sort of provides an early methodology that I think can be useful. And let me just give you the full quote here from volume 11, chapter 2 of the Schaff edition. He says, quote, "Moreover, in the Catholic Church itself, all possible care must be taken that We hold that faith which has been believed everywhere, always by all. For that is truly and in the strictest sense Catholic, which, as the name itself and the reason of the thing declare, comprehends all universally. This rule we follow, this rule we shall observe if we follow, and these are going to be his notes: universality, antiquity, consent. So first, we shall follow universality if we confess that one faith to be true, which the whole church throughout the world confess. Two, antiquity, if we in no wise depart from those interpretations which it is manifest were notoriously held by our holy ancestors and fathers. And finally, consent. In like manner, if in antiquity itself we adhere to the consentient definitions and determinations of all, or at least of almost all priests and doctors. Now, I think St. Vincent offers an excellent, I mean, it's a very fine blueprint. And I say this with all due respect to the saint, that while it is true and helpful as a rule of thumb, so to speak, in a sense, it's almost too broad to really be helpful to the theologian seeking to demarcate between authentic, spurious, and corrupt doctrines. Basically, every side, I mean, unless you're a Mormon, will claim the Vincentian canon as their own. So clearly, the discipline demands more exactitude. For that, I follow personally St. John Henry Cardinal Newman in his development of doctrine found in his an essay on the development of Christian doctrine. I'll be interested to see which title they assigned Cardinal Newman because the title will indicate or at least act as a tell of how the magisterium wants his thought to be applied to dogmatics. And now, as a doctor, assuming the title they give him has something to do with his essay, he'd be a helpful guide for historians, for theologians, as a low-key theologese for navigating something like the complexity of the topic today, the development of marriage as a sacrament. But his approach, I think, offers more a set of indicators, notes as they're called, rather than a roadmap that walks you by the hand from point A to B to C. He gives us these notes. There are seven of them altogether, and I'm just going to kind of run through them quickly. I've covered them on this channel before, but just to give you an idea, because it'll help, I think it'll be helpful through this presentation. One, the preservation of type. The preservation of type is an essential character or identity of the doctrine, and this character will remain consistent with its original form even as the doctrine develops. And this is what the Vincentian canon refers to analogously as a plant growing from a seed while staying the same species. Two, there's a continuity of principles. A doctrine doesn't just live in isolation. There are foundational principles of the faith. It's not just specific propositions. So for something like the Nicene and Chalcedonian definitions of the our Christology, you can trace the continuity of what was happening through those developments. There's the power of assimilation. This is the doctrine's ability to incorporate external ideas, practices, or cultural elements without losing its core. This one is of particular interest to me. It tends to be a bit controversial with people. This is one of those ones where the less unscrupulous among us will sometimes want to use something like this to take Newman's developments in places where it was not intended to go, which in turn leads the critics of Newman to say that Newman is guilty of this. But basically, as a doctrine, what Newman is saying is that as a doctrine is introduced to new stressors, it should be able to assimilate without, the key there, without losing its integrity. So for marriage, some of the externals of the ceremonial aspect of marriage, these may change, but the essential elements will be present throughout time. Fourth, there's a logical sequence, the logical progression of the doctrine from earlier teachings, unfolding implications that were latent in the original doctrine. Again, like the following, if you follow the development of Christology through the first four councils, there should be no illogical leaps from A to C without having passed through B first. Or at least you should be able to have the ability to demonstrate how A could move through B to C. There's an anticipation of its future, a natural progression towards, fuller articulation over time, because many of these notes, continuity, sequential, anticipatory, are all to help the theologian as he's sitting at his table doing his work of theology to be able to find the thread that links this doctrine back to the deposit of faith. Which, if you know Newman, he was still an Anglican when he began this work, and it was his project actually to trace the English Reformation back into the first century and into the apostles and Christ himself, which he eventually found himself unable to do, which led to his turning to Rome in the end. But there's a conservative action upon its past. This is typically where the Dominicans will step in and tell the Franciscans or Jesuits they've gone too far. Newman, he says that, we need these conservative voices. And at times, conservative action, itself will keep these developments from turning into something that gets away from that preservation of type. Finally, there's chronic vigor. It needs the doctrine needs to be able to stand the test of time. There's no way the church can anticipate all the future challenges, all the changes that happen to cultures and societies and the church itself that an authentic, Christology, for example, is going to undergo. But the hypostatic union, as it's elucidated over time, needs to be able to withstand the onslaught of the Monophysites or the Monothelites or the Saracens and so on. So that's the rundown. I would always suggest that as we have these kinds of discussions, as you see me helping you guys wade into theology a little bit more, to have some kind of methodology, and I was expressing this last night, but to have some kind of methodology at your disposal to help you, because this is how a theologian is supposed to work. As you're applying your principles of the Catholic faith to the doctrine that you're looking at, this is a tool, this is a set of indicators to help you through the process. And we didn't quite, I don't know, with the way discussions go, sometimes it's hard to like completely tie up the bow nicely at the end there, but the intention, and I think Christian did a good job of explaining this kind of off the cuff, but the intention of including a conversation of development of doctrine on a topic like this is that, especially when you're having to deal with Protestants, they're going to want to be looking for specific indicators, really in those earliest centuries. I mean, the more into the Protestant Reformation that you get, they're going to actually become stricter about this. The Anglo-Catholics, they might be a little bit different, but this is a certain methodology that sort of allows you to look at the complexity of something like the development of marriage over time and just have a way of working through it for yourself, if nothing else, but also for the Catholics that are out there that might be struggling with this, or with the Protestants who just may have questions about it. So there are roughly three historical phases of the development of marriage, and I would say that they are the early church period, the High Middle Ages, and then the Tridentine. Now, I would further subdivide the early church into before and after Augustine. Now, the theologically informed discussions around marriage before the 10th century are fairly rare to begin with, pre-Augustine even more so. The early fragmentary record is a challenge to all Christian studies, and Catholics and Eastern Orthodox, for that matter, need to be aware, as I was saying, that any Protestant worth his own is going to take you precisely to this point in history because the record is so fragmentary. This is where the educated Protestant will say, I want you to show me this doctrine here at this time. And typically, it's the uneducated evangelical type that may even try to limit you to sacred scripture alone. That's its own problems. But your more knowledgeable Protestant will be more than willing to walk with you through the first several centuries. But they'll demand that we show them the clearly explicated evidence of the said doctrine, which is why, we need to establish an epistemic foundation of how we can identify authentic development from the outset. Otherwise, I think we just end up talking past each other. And that's what's so important about adding the development of doctrine to this conversation. A good faith Protestant, I truly believe, once they understand our ecclesiology and our methodology, while they may disagree with us, with the careful study, they couldn't walk away believing that the church, by like fiat and a blank check, just casually drops doctrines on the faithful. But some, kind of preliminary remarks that I think all sides, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, could agree on. One, as far as it being a thing that Christians were doing, marriage was there from the beginning. We have sacred scripture attesting to it. We have historical evidence of it in the archaeological records, the Ordines and the homiletics. I have a book of these really beautiful homilies from St. John Chrysostom on marriage. So clearly, this is something that Christians did in praxis. And as we were saying in the discussion yesterday, that this is an important way to see how to weigh the essential aspects of a doctrine's the particular note that it holds in terms of its certainty is by the common usage, the common practice. So marriage is something that all Christians are involved in. Now, I also think it's very important to bring up that concurrent to the development of the particular sacraments is the development of the idea of a sacrament as such. In the first millennium, there are several senses in which sacramentum is used. So if you're studying this, you have to be careful to avoid the word concept fallacy, lest you be guilty of the dreaded quote mining Catholics are often accused of. In the sense we're discussing today, the sacramentum were these ritual mysteries, the mysterion of the church, which incorporated, I say this as in the true sense of the word, incorpo, to embody the use of elements such as water, oil, bread, wine. This is going to be important for the later conversations in the Middle Ages, especially as it comes around to the controversies of marriage. So Augustine says, and it's kind of funny, I think you need to turn to Augustine even in the pre-Augustine period to make sense of what's already happening. But he says in his Tractates on the Gospel of John, take away the word, and the water is neither more nor less than water. The word, verbum, is added to the element, the elementum, and there results the sacrament, as if itself also a kind of visible word. The sacrament, then, is the application of a word over an elementum, an element. So these two points, verbum and elementum, are going to be key later, as we'll see. Saint Isidore of Seville takes it a little bit further that he says that under these rituals are an action where, under the cover of corporal things, the divine secretly brings about a saving effect, a salus. There is then a saving effect to be applied to the true and proper sacraments of the new law. All of this is really important because it will later affect the debates at the time of the Reformation. Now, it's not really until the 11th century, after the rise of Cluny and the entire 11th century Renaissance, that we begin to see any rigorous discussion about which of these rituals classify as the kind of sacramentum we speak of here. At this early period, there were theories that the, anointing of a king may be one of them, that the tonsure of a monk may be its own unique one. These were still being debated at this time, but In short, in these pre-Augustan centuries, all of the communions were all looking through the same kind of hazy prism, attempting to wrest it for ourselves. And that's really all I was going to say pre-Augustine. The praxis is there both for the sacrament qua sacrament and for the sacrament qua marriage, even if the theological language is not being applied as such yet. Now for St. Augustine, I want you guys to just there's a few things to kind of realize about this. I mean, he's the basis for the entire medieval framework. Later medieval theologians will turn to Augustine as their primary source for the conclusions that they draw. And it is true, though, that this is something you'll see the Protestants bring up, that you have to consider that those theologians of the times and the centuries after Augustine are not necessarily drawing from the full corpus of Augustine. There's no chaff edition of Augustine's work, as I like to say. What you have are these various florilegia, which tend to have the same manuscript from one monastery to the next. And this is what these theologians are drawing from. But this too, I think, becomes a source of contention later in the Renaissance and the rise of humanism, where all of a sudden access to a wider corpus of these early writers become available to more people. These people then in turn are going to use certain discrepancies that may not have been a monk writing after Augustine may not have been aware about, maybe even certain ambiguities that these later humanists and the reformers are going to find they're going to use as an attempt to undermine the church's credibility in all areas, not just marriage, but marriage as well. So again, the historian or the theologian needs to have a proper hermeneutical lens with which to absorb and filter this information. And we'll come back around to that in the end. But to give an overview of Augustine's position on marriage, I have just a few points to kind of highlight. One, marriage is a good. Augustine affirms that though celibacy is a superior calling, he says that it is heretical to even suggest that marriage is not a good. For this, I would recommend you go and you turn to De Moribus Manicorium or Contra Faustum Manichaeum. This is in the height of Augustine's dealing with the Manichaean heresy and specifically its dualist notions about the evil of marriage and children and so forth. Two, he says that the function of marriage changed as human society progresses throughout history. It went from an obligation of Genesis 1 to multiply to a remedial function. De Gentia contra Manichaeos is a good reference for this. He gives three benefits of marriage. This is faith, including both fidelity as a sign of the spouse's fidelity to the Lord, as well as a conjugal debt as a sign of man's obligation to God. For offspring, the happy acceptance of children, especially this idea of it being a happy acceptance, a willing acceptance as children as a good, in the same sense that marriage is a good. This is against his with the Manichaeans. And then finally, sacrament with, the idea that here is that within the contractual obligations of marriage, there's a bond that takes place that is a lifetime bond. Another point to highlight, he believes that the consecrated life of celibacy is a higher calling than married life. I would say turn to De Bono Conigali for that. These are all, I'm drawing these, I pulled these from the Reynolds really long tome on marriage, and I think this is a good summary of where Augustine falls on all this. Finally, he believes that the endurance of this contract, this marriage contract, transcends just procreation and the remedial exigency, since it's binding for those couples who are also infertile or for whatever reason cannot see the contractual obligation of the marital debts through. So he's going to be the one all the way up through the Renaissance, all the way up. Even the reformers will use them, though they tend to shift the definitions. Augustine's going to be the one that everybody sort of turns to. Post Augustine, we find something of a lacuna between the writings of Augustine versus the 11th, 12th century revivals of marriage as a discussion of theological interest. I made reference yesterday to Bishop Jonas of Orleans. He does give us an important work, but historians at this juncture mostly are going to rely on a fragmented trail of evidence, including ordines and penitentials, which is an important thing to stress because, I emphasized this yesterday because stepping back, I want to say that everybody has to remember all during this time, from the time that Christ institutes it up through the time of the apostles, all the way through the debates around Augustine and the Manichaeans, the sort of later periods, all the way up into the high Middle Ages when these things are being debated, all through the time of the Reformation, all the way up to our very own day, the church is going about the work of doing the church, which includes marriages. So no matter what you see kind of taking place at these like sort of specific highlights that we're looking at, just remember that couples are getting married, and as far as we can tell, they have a sense, an idea that something, and this is even, I would say this even solidifies more in the lay conscious and the consciousness of the average secular priest and the average bishop that's not necessarily as theologically trained, that something important and special and sacred is happening with marriage. So going back to Newman's development, the note of a logical sequence, you can ask, is the presence of the type at least latent, and how it comes down through the centuries? Because I completely understand, yes, at times it is frustrating to have these periods of a scant record. Because if you're an apologist, it allows the reformers, for example, to cry foul, which they're wont to do. They will say, hey, it's here at this point, or at this point that the corruption has crept in, and you don't have a lot that you can draw from to show them otherwise. But if the modes of development that you're using as the metric by which we ascertain authentic development from a corruption, we can see, as per Newman's logical sequence, when we leave Augustine, when we enter into this period of relative darkness as far as the extant source material is concerned, and then we step back into the light of history. Again, in the 11th century, we see that this was an established practice going into that period, and we can at least follow logically, sequentially, how the development would have come to the 12th century as it did without ever having to concede corruption. By the time of Augustine, by the 11th century, as Christians are getting married, as the bishops, the couple, the public, the jurists, they all know something unique is happening. They may not be able to articulate it, such as someone that lives on the other side of Trent can. Now, I think for a locus here, you can turn to just the relevance of Augustine's particular works. I didn't get to mention this last night, but when we find the Florilegia of Augustine in these monasteries, in these libraries, an interesting thing happens. And this happens in other areas, not just in the subject of marriage, but we tend to find a pretty, now, not every library is going to have the exact same works, but let's say you go to a library in one area of France, and then you go to another monastic library in another area of France, and you pull out the Florilegia of Augustine on marriage, you're going to likely find the same works. You're going to find De Bono Conjugali, De Sancta Virginitate, De Bono Viduitatis, his Epistula 130, 200, 167, 172, and as well you're going to find the relevant portions of the Retractationes. And an interesting thing about that, though, is that they're also typically within the same order within the Florilegia. So this kind of tells us how these monastics at least are transmitting Augustine and which ones that they kind of want to draw to the top. So if you're a theologian and you're sitting down with Augustine on marriage, these like they want to make sure this is the first one that you see. And of course, kind of makes sense that you would follow it all up with his retractions at the very end, just to sort of see where he like lands on the other end of all of this. As well, I did go over this last night. There were some magisterial developments that take place at the time that are always worth mentioning because this, along with the praxis at a ground level, we can take another aerial view of praxis at the magisterial level. Denzinger's 30th edition has, in the pre-Augustine era, zero mentions of marriage. In Augustine's lifetime, there's one. I don't have my Denzinger handy right here, but I want to say this is Pope Saint Siricius the First. I could be wrong about that. Don't quote me. Post Augustine, though, there are 16 references of marriage within Denzinger, all the way up through Second Leon's, and then of course at Second Leon's you get a very important profession of faith of Michael Paleologus, the Byzantine emperor, and Denzinger 465, which includes among the seven sacraments it mentions marriage. As well as the Council of Florence, the same thing with the decree of the Armenians, which the Armenians are going to have to sign to enter back into union with Rome, that they believe that there are seven sacraments, which includes marriage, and that's Denzinger 702. So this was Kevin's addition. He just wanted to make some, use of the liturgical developments of exegeting certain scriptural passages, and I thought he did a really good job of that. I'm not even going to attempt to elaborate on what he had to say. Go watch the discussion that we had. I did make some, there's some interesting things about the Gregorian sacramentary that are worth it, which is kind of my own little aside, but definitely go watch the video to see his elaborations on these liturgical passages. Again, the liturgical developments are very important as well to see, once things start to enter the liturgy and become normalized, and especially once they start to become more ubiquitous, universal, that's a good sign that there's going to be a higher degree of certainty around the development of this, as well as a high degree of certainty around the ability to claim it as a true and right doctrine. Okay, so I think that the first major development coming in the wake of the 11th century Renaissance is going to be Peter Lombard's Summa Sententiarum, the Book of Sentences. Now, I didn't get to stress this enough yesterday, but remember that the Lombard originally compiles the sentences as a response to his master, Peter Abelard, who drops the sic et non on the students. Now, I give Abelard a hard time, but I was thinking about this after we were talking last night because Abelard, and I was incorrect. Maybe I think somebody, well, I think Christian brought up Saint Bernard. Saint Bernard does come after Abelard, but he doesn't come after him for sic et non. And I don't know why I didn't catch this last night, but Bernard goes after Abelard for Abelard's teachings on the Trinity. And specifically, there's a series of condemned Abelardian propositions at the Council of Sens that Bernard had was a part of. So there's a very specific sense in which Abelard was condemned, or at least some of, not Abelard personally, but some of his ideas were condemned. The thing about it is, though, is that Abelard he submitted to the council's findings. Not long after that council, he basically, I think, showed signs of real sanctity by turning. He stopped teaching and he went and kind of lived a life of penance and prayer in a monastery. Sic et non is actually not what Saint Bernard was after, though Bernard was critical of what was taking place in the university. But I think to attempt to give a fair assessment of maybe what Abelard was doing, and this might be my being too charitable towards Abelard here, but if I had to guess, I think probably what's going on is that there's no real understanding at this point in time of the academic privilege, academic freedom, tenure, and these kinds of things. But I can imagine a case where a good professor walks in with a series of challenges to his students and teaches on this and basically says, all right, guys, your assignment is to figure this out. And so when Abelard presents his sic et non, he's giving these apparent contradictions in the early church fathers. And there is a sense that I want to say that Abelard does this to just cause trouble. I think there's a little bit of like, look how smart I am, look at what I discovered. What are you going to do about this? But on the what are you going to do about this side of things, I think it's not improbable that he actually wants to give to his students a real challenge. And again, I think whether it was intentional or not, he pretty much ends up kickstarting the entire medieval dialectic process because one of his students was Peter Lombard. And it appears that Peter Lombard took the challenge very seriously because he comes up with this summa of all of the scripture, the relevant scriptural passages, so the relevant passages from the early church fathers, along with his own commentaries. And he is seeking to sort of, in a way that Abelard didn't even do, to systematically go through all of these seeming problems and finds attempts as where he could to synthesize or to at least present the various options, which will later afford other thinkers a chance to provide their own commentaries to what Lombard has brought forth. So with Lombard, though, there and as far as marriage goes, with the sentences, there's a general consensus forming around the time of Lombard. He offers no analysis on why he settles on seven. That would have been interesting to hear his position on that, but we just don't get that from him. But what he does give us is in his distinctions on the sacraments an interesting tell because out of all the six baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, penance, extreme unction, holy orders, all of them, I mean, not, I mean, gets the most next to matrimony, but it only gets nine, whereas matrimony is almost double that. It gets 17 different distinctions. So I think this is Lombard's way. First it's an attempt to synthesize and work through the seeming challenges and ambiguities, as we're saying. But it's almost like the early scholastic commentators are going to follow Lombard in believing that one, marriage is kind of the least certain of all the sacraments listed. And in so much as it was a sacrament, whether it was one that confers grace or some kind of preternatural grace, many of your commentators, at least early in this debate, are going to be hesitant to say much about that. Now, Lombard offers with this 17, I think it's a clear indication that he's saying this is the one that we really need to kind of spend some time with and work through to buttress up the fact that it is one of the seven true and proper sacraments. Of course, one of the key thinkers in this is going to be Alexander of Hales. He dies 1245. Alexander of Hales, there's a lot of interesting things that are happening around all of this, and I always have to keep myself in check of how far afield I want to get with this stuff. But the thing with Alexander of Hales is it's one of these areas that I'm super fascinated in right now. But consider this. Alexander comes to the University of Paris. He receives the chair of the theological faculty at the University of Paris, which is still a new thing. It's still kind of coming into its own. And after he does that, he takes the habit of a Franciscan. And the Franciscans at this point, along with just the idea of a mendicant orders in general, is still very controversial. And so it's something of a coup. I call it something of a revolutionary coup. This is why, I think I said this yesterday, and I don't know if, I don't know if hopefully Christian or Kevin weren't, like thrown off by this. But when I say that the universities were a revolution, I'm being very specific and precise in what I mean by that, because I'm not saying that they like revolutionized and overthrew the old theology, but what I'm saying is that the fact that this new sort of radical orders, the Dominicans, the Franciscans, the fact that you would have one of them, because the universities were not at first very friendly towards the idea of these mendicant orders even coming into the universities. They saw them as something of upstarts, as, kind of on the fringe. And so what I think happens is that the students, though, there's this like atmosphere and this air of like excitement around the new mendicant orders, and so the students like they eat it up, they love it. So Alexander of Hales, he becomes a master at University of Paris, then becomes a Franciscan, and basically from that point forward, the universities are for a very long time are going to be chaired by either Dominicans or Franciscans. And as a result of that, Alexander of Hales is, of course, also willing, because there's these conservative elements within the universities that would not have been very happy to necessarily have, say, for example, these disputations around the various distinctions in the Lombard sentences. Alexander of Hales is part of this group, this sort of revolutionary group that brings in the sentences of Lombard into the curriculum at Paris, thereby laying the foundation for the rest of the entire, medieval commentorium tradition. Now, as far as the subject of marriage goes, he takes a very specific turn where he says that there is a verbal consent of the spouses. This is going to give rise to the solus consensus, which becomes so important. That the consent of the spouses dispose them to the graces in a manner of a sacramentum et res. This is like this interior consent that allows for the joining of the wills. And if you can get your hands on it, I would recommend just going through the Glossa and Librum Quartum Centarium. This is his commentary on the sentences. I'm going to come back to this because I didn't really get into this yesterday, but there's an important aspect to the solus consensus here. And then, as well, in his Questiones Disputate, he says that the old law of marriage does not cause something that it signifies, whereas in the new law, marriage signifies the grace of conquering or lessening the corruption of concupiscence, which is a penalty of original sin. And honestly, I didn't really get a chance yesterday as well either to highlight some of the importances of why I'm bringing these specific things up. There was sort of a chain of thought that I had that, again, like with the discussion, it's hard to put a nice bow on top of everything. But all of this is very important because he's teaching that conjugal love supernaturally elevates human love. And the consent of the spouses, is going to dispose them to receiving the divine charity as a gift, which further enhances their love for one another. But marriage, says Alexander, is not to be said to confer sanctifying grace in and of itself, quantum in se est, because the spouses themselves establish the disposition, whereas for the other sacraments, the role of the minister brings this about. So Alexander is sort of going through and saying, look, we have ministers in these other sacraments. They're the ones that bring this thing about. I believe there's a grace involved in this sacrament, but we just don't have any way of saying that this grace is going to be conferred as a sanctifying grace, because in and of itself, it's the spouses that give the disposition for the reception of the sacrament as opposed to the benediction of a minister. So, but the important thing is that Alexander is going to say, because up to the point of Alexander, marriage is seen as remedial. But with Alexander, the discussion is going to become not so much about whether or not it confers grace, but what kind of grace it confers and how it confers it. And this is, even though this is something that Alexander introduces, keep in mind that when you open up the canon law, really up through the 14th century, kind of long after Alexander of Hales, because even though he's writing in the early 13th century, and he's now sort of opened the door to marriage as a true sacrament which confers a grace, it's not as if there's this immediate revision of canon law, because that's just not how history works. Though I think he does kind of change the tide about how we're going to begin our discussions of marriage. Bonaventure, I kind of went through this pretty in depth yesterday, I think. He does not explicitly nor even implicitly say that it doesn't confer grace. He really just leaves it open. His main work, the Breviloquium, where he discusses his main work as far as where he discusses matrimony, doesn't really go into the controversy at all. He kind of leaves it open. I included the quote from the Breviloquium for the fact that he mentions that it further that the union in marriage now further signifies the union of Christ with the church, which is going to have an effect for the exegesis, as we will see, because at this point, they're starting with the introduction of the Lombard, as we'll see in a little bit, they're starting to think of marriage as a sacramentum, as a true sacrament in the sense, because we talked about this in the discussion yesterday. This was Kevin and Christian had quite a bit to say about this, about the union of Christ with the church as a sacrament. And this is where you really begin to see that introduced into the conversation. And Bonaventure in his Breviloquium is not even like saying it as necessarily an opinion here. He's just kind of presenting it. Now, whereas in his commentary, it's kind of interesting because I think it's hard to really kind of pin Bonaventure on where he stands on the subject of this, but I want to say the one thing that I could say is with the commentary of the sentences, which is an earlier work, and I think one where he's probably more likely to be like sort of freer with his pen as opposed to the Breviloquium, which is much more precise in what the language, theological language that he's using. But he does say that the reason that it's able to confer grace. So here he's acknowledging actually that it confers grace. But it's by reason of the benediction joined to it, which means that it's by the blessing of the priest that it's able to confer grace. Thomas, we talked a little bit about yesterday. I wish I would have been a little bit more prepared for Thomas, but the distinctions of law, I think, is probably the most important thing to remember for St. Thomas here. You can, of course, go to his sentences, his commentary on the sentences. That's where you're really going to get most of what Thomas has to say about marriage as a sacrament. The Summa Theologiae is going to be in the supplementum, which is after Thomas had stopped writing. So it's really going to be his students attempting to preserve his thought. And my understanding is they're mostly going to be turning to the commentary of the sentences to write the supplementum on matrimony. But the distinctions of law are important because he wants to add to it some ideas of, excuse me, I don't think he's necessarily adding to it. Later jurists are going to add to Thomas's teachings on, say, like positive law when they're looking back and they want to apply some of the restrictions that they're going to place on marriage. It's going to be really based on some of the issues around clandestine marriage and the requiring there to be a minister present, and how does that affect this idea of solus consensus. But we're going to talk about all that in a minute. But it's important to know that the distinctions that Thomas makes around law, even though he's not necessarily applying it himself to the concept of marriage as a sacrament, it is going to sort of bear its fruit later as other people apply back to it, or appeal back to it, rather. All right, so now we got some of these dissenting voices, and we talked about them as well. And I didn't get to go into marriage as an estate yesterday, and I wish I really could have drove that home because this is going to become the major point of contention with the Reformation. And I think I was really close to saying it, and then I got derailed by my own temptations to go off on tangents, and I never steered the plane back right. But I would say that the idea here, well, I'm going to go into it again in a little bit, but keep in mind this is Peter John O'Leary. Peter John O'Leary believes that he's appealing back to the earlier sources of the church before the Lombard introduces Ephesians 5, which we're going to get into here in a second. But the response to O'Leary doing this at this point in time, this is 1298, so this is, we're after Second Council of Lyon, where marriage has been included among the list of the seven sacraments. We're after Bonaventure. We're after St. Thomas of Aquinas. Of course, we're after the Lombard. We're given enough space here where its ideas are starting to solidify in the general consensus of the theologians' minds. And so when Olivi begins preaching about this and teaching that marriage as an estate, his brother friars kind of react poorly to this, and they turn to the minister general of the conventuals, who puts out the response. It's the Littera Septum Sigillorium, And he says that, quote, marriage is a sacrament of the new law that confers grace, and to affirm contrary is erroneous, to sustain the contrary is heretical, and to doubt it is entirely forbidden. So the Minister General is basically telling Levy here, and we're going to get into the debate between, this idea of estate versus act here in a little bit, but the thing that I was trying to stress here is that the response to Olivi, as you can see by his direct superior, is fairly strong. I would say that's fairly strong. That's very like I'm giving you a clear warning here to stop what you're saying. To affirm the contrary, you're basically erroneous. If you're going to sustain it, we're going to have to start going into the territory of heresy at that point. As well, you have Durandus of Porcane, who also wants to say that it's not a sacrament strictly and properly so called as are the other sacraments of the new law. And he wants to say that it does not confer any grace. Now, they both explicitly say that marriage is this kind of like quasi sacrament, and I mentioned it yesterday too, that this is the kind of language that you'll see the Anglo Catholics apply a lot of the times, where with, they will, in the typical Reformed fashion, they're going to want to hold to baptism as a sacrament and the Eucharist as a sacrament, but they're going to want to leave the rest aside. The Anglo Catholics will want to kind of draw those five back into the picture, but they're going to give it this sort of quasi element to it where it's not truly a sacrament. It's not a proper sacrament, so called. All right, so I included here just some of these later thinkers. It's a little bit tangential, not always tied directly into where the conversation is, but I wanted to just sort of illustrate that we're really begin to narrow the scope down of what the debate's about. Blessed John Duns Scotus, 1308, is when he dies, and he insists that the spoken word, the verba certa, was essential to the sacrament, and that the sacrament does confer grace. Thomas Cajetan argues, actually like Scotus, that a sacramental marriage requires a personal matter, a passio personalis. Otherwise, he says that the marriage is merely contractual. So basically, what they're saying here is, Cajetan's saying that you need to have the two individuals, man and woman, present. You can't just have them sign a contract and they're not in front of each other, right? So they have to have the personal matter, the passio personalis, and then they have to have the verba certa, the spoken words, and these are the essential aspects of the sacrament to take place. And then once that happens, a grace is conferred. And then finally, you have Melchor Cano, who held that, believing a marriage contracted without a minister present was not sacramental, was an allowable position to hold. So the idea there is, again, he's basically saying, like Cajetan, that it would be merely contractual at that point. It would be a valid marriage, but not necessarily illicit marriage. And he's even saying too that this is okay. This is a permissible position to hold. It's allowable. He's not saying it's the common opinion. He's not claiming that. All of this I said would culminate in Trent, the Council of Trent, which would come to define marriage as a sacrament truly and properly. And this is meaning, and this you could see it here in the definition that Trent gives in the canon. If anyone says that matrimony is not truly and properly vere et proprie, one of the seven sacraments of the evangelical law instituted by Christ the Lord, but has been devised by men in the church and does not confer grace, let him be an anathema. So the council is saying, look, marriage, from the moment that Christ elevates it, down through the apostles, penning sacred scripture, down through the centuries, has always been a true sacrament of the new law in the same way that baptism is, in the same way that the Eucharist is. There is no haziness. The language of quasiness is no longer, of quasi-sacramentum is no longer allowable. This is where Trent is going to lead the church to. Now you might be thinking, okay, that's a big jump between where we kind of like left off in the Middle Ages and now all of a sudden Trent is saying this. But of course, in the interim period between these debates and Trent, we have the outbreak of the Protestant Reformation, which in some ways it's a revival of the medieval debates and the earlier forms of the debate over some of the debates that the church considered further down the path toward being settled. And so this is where I kind of moved into the idea of some of the debates with the Reformation. So they did an excellent job yesterday. I'm not going to like hammer this home too much of what's happening here with the biblical basis for these arguments, but I will just say that the pre-11th nuptial ordines will cite the Old Testament with references largely based on primordial or natural marriage of Adam and Eve. As well, they'll discuss the marriages of the patriarchs, of the exemplary Old Testament wives. They'll have readings of Psalm 127, 1 Corinthians 7, of John 1 with the wedding feast of Cana. The Ordines also don't give us what the priest was thinking or what he wrote down when he gave his homily. We're exceptionally lucky if we have the homilies of priests that have been preserved and handed down to us. But the idea of marriage as a proper sacrament that confers grace, which emerges after Alexander and it gains traction, we will see an emphasis in this discussion taking place where Ephesians 5 begins to develop and emerge out of it. Now, as I mentioned, the passage it was referenced, I mentioned this last night in the Gregorianum, but even the emphasis there is on marriage as something primordial and perennial. It was saying, that from the beginning, marriage was there and it's existed down through the ages. At this later stage, though, the emphasis is on the allusion to Christ and the church and the mystery, the sacramentum. Now the Lombard asks, of what res is marriage a sacrament? And he answers then with Ephesians 5:31, 32. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become flesh, one flesh. This is a great mystery, and I'm applying it to Christ and the church. So he says that the union of Christ and the church are a res of the sacrament. They're the thing of the sacrament. Now, the theologians at this juncture were saying that sacraments were a signum sacrae rei, a sign of a sacred thing. Marriage as a sacrament, therefore, was a sign of Christ in the church. Now, this inevitably brings up questions then, because with other sacraments, water, for example, it bears a certain resemblance to the thing it signifies. It cleanses. Bread and wine, a semblance to the thing they signify, the body and blood. So, how then does marriage in this way signify the thing it represents? And also, how is it ministered? And who ministers it? So, this late use of the Pauline passage will become a major point of contention for reformers, especially since we don't have that widespread, extant early use of it in this capacity. Now, I was thinking, and I did bring this up yesterday, that I think that there's a point to be made that once again, and I probably annoy you guys with this, but this is kind of like my points that I drive home when I'm thinking about these things, that you're drawing different conclusions because you're really beginning with different premises. You're using different methodology. We have an entire different ecclesiology than what the Protestants use. A Catholic will say, look, in the fourth century, St. Cyril comes along, fourth, fifth century, and St. Cyril of Alexandria, and he is thinking about this thing that's Christians are already aware of. They're already participating in it, this process of sanctification. And he's saying, like, what does this? He's reflecting on it and he's turning to an infallible source of authority, sacred scripture. We would agree to that. Protestants would agree to that. That's a commonality right there. But the Catholics say, St. Cyril, he's illumined by the light of the Holy Spirit. He pulls out of sacred scripture a spiritual insight where in the Second Peter 1:4 he draws the reference that Saint Peter gives there of the Christian becoming a sharer and a partaker of the divine nature, and Saint Cyril applies that to this doctrine of divinization that has been developing up to this time. But before Saint Cyril, you wouldn't have really found any of the church fathers, or many of the church fathers anyways, referencing Second Peter. They would have been more honestly turning to the Psalm 81 because this is how the sort of Jewish tradition had read it up to that point, and they were sort of merging out of the Jewish tradition. But after St. Cyril, though, it becomes a common usage for to discuss divinization that various other church fathers began using that passage. So if this is sort of the model of how the church is done, and again, I know the Protestants, they don't necessarily, they'll just dismiss Cyril. They'll ad hoc use them when they want to, or dismiss them when they don't want to. Or if they have this type of ecclesiology, then they actually need to be answerable to this kind of thing. Because what we see the Lombard doing in a later century is something very similar. While Ephesians 5 may not have been used in the precise way that he's using it, the Lombard is turning to a passage of Scripture, an infallible source, in the same way that St. Cyril was. And, St. Cyril doesn't just come up with divinization out of nowhere, but he begins to reference a passage that speaks to it, and then the church adopts it over time as a passage that speaks to divinization. So the Lombard, in the same way, when he turns to Ephesians 5 as a passage dealing with the sacramentum, the mystery of marriage as one of the mysteries of the rites of the new law, I see what he's doing there as participating in the same type of church, same type of ecclesiology as that which St. Cyril had participated in. There were also other theological implications which flow from this notion of Christ and church. For one, the union between Christ and church is indissoluble. And we find the theologians working through this indissoluble qua Christ and church relation to indissoluble between man and woman married. As well, and this is a very important one, as I'm coming back to this from some of our things we were discussing earlier, the idea of solus consensus, and this is extremely important to understand. I didn't get to go into this yesterday, but this really takes you all the way down to the Council of Trent. So what solus consensus means is that parental concerns, dowries, contracts, witnesses, rights, nuptial blessings, while all of these things may be very important, they may be very pious, they may have long-standing traditions, they actually have no effect on the validity of the sacrament. The only thing that really matters to the validity of the sacrament is the mutual consent of the spouses. And this was an aha moment for me. And if you guys, just kind of indulge me here as always, but I think it's important to illustrate were expediency or some other connivance, the criteria for which these churchmen acted. This would never have been an issue because it ends up causing this particular belief here of solus consensus, ends up causing the medieval church a logistic nightmare. One that easily could have been remedied with a simple decree if they thought that they had that kind of power to leverage, as we're so often accused of by the Protestants and Orthodox. But the idea of the solus consensus really does a lot of, I mean, I can imagine a lot of your theologians getting gray hairs over this at the time because Hugh of St. Victor, he's a name which actually deserves a lot of attention, and we didn't really give much to him yesterday, but he deserves a lot of attention in this particular subject of marriage as well. He gives a long treatment on the problem of what's known as these clandestine marriages. Basically, what this is you would have a man and a woman. They would go off. They would claim to go off anyways. Whether they did or not, no one really knows. It's clandestine. They would come back, never having used a priest or anything, but they would come back. Maybe they went off into the woods or something. And they'd come back and they'd say, hey, we declared our mutual consent to each other and we're now married. And as you can imagine, this caused not just an administrative nightmare, but also a theological one. As, let's say down the road, the couple has a falling out and the guy wants to bail, the jurists are left going, well, wait a minute, did they enter into this union like aware of the indissolubility of marriage? Did they actually give each other their consent? The guy's claiming now he didn't know anything about the indissolubility of marriage and that he didn't actually give his consent. So, is he just free to go? Like you can see, this is kind of a damaging thing, real time, real life. So if it were the case then that the church just kind of like willy-nilly hands out these doctrines, Solo's consensus would have been one that they would, I think many of them probably would have gladly just let go of. And later on, when it comes down to Trent, well, first, actually, the first part of the solution comes down to Lateran 4, which bans clandestine marriages. But later on with Trent, they're going to ask for the minister's presence of a marriage in order for it to be listed as a sacramental marriage and as a form of positive law. This is where they begin to draw from St. Thomas here, that, it's not that the marriage is invalid. It very well could be a valid marriage, but through the use of positive law, they're going to come in and say that for the good of the church, for the good of the couple, we have to have a minister present. And, it very well could be the case that the minister is present as well to see that the conferring of the sacramental grace take place as well. But this is a major hangup. And this is one of the last really disputed issues before Trent. The issue of the clandestine marriage is a huge problem all the way up through to Trent. Then the last thing was impediments to marriage, which again they disputed these things to no end. And when you read some of the manuals around marriage in the church through really the 20th century, they can kind of read like a car manual because they're very heavily concerned with the proper validity of a marriage. Now, one of the things that's very easy to lose track of in this, much of the debate is going to center around the act. I got into this a little bit yesterday, but I want to like highlight a little bit more about this. As it may be evident to the Catholic theologians, who are engaged in this in the Middle Ages, they are laser focused on the sacramental act. And I find that this can be a bit perplexing to people newly introduced to high medieval scholasticism, but the idea is that in the same way that baptism is an act, that it takes place in time, in the same way that confirmation is an act, in the same way that penance, you go, you confess, and then you're absolved, that's an act, takes place in time. Well, for marriage, there is this idea that it is an estate, an status. Now, marriage as an estate is not equivocally contrary to Catholic teaching, but it's a secondary a function of marriage. It's marriage in its more natural status. The result of viewing marriage as an act, as a sacramental act, though, is that it places marriage pretty much squarely in the domain of the church. And there's tension throughout the Middle Ages, really throughout all of human history, and in many different areas. But specifically here, tension over who holds prerogatives over something like marriage, the church or the state. Well, if it's a sacramental act that takes place in time, then the state really has no say in the matter. And Lateran 4 going so far as to say that marriages, like, or excuse me, yeah, Lateran 4 says that they need to take place in a church. They shouldn't be clandestine. Trent coming along and saying that they need to have a minister present. All of these decrees and developments converge on the church's wider control over society. Now, I don't say control as a pejorative either. This isn't a discussion on integralism, but as you guys can imagine, the reform, in many ways, the Reformation, is just as much about the emergence of the modern nation state asserting itself as it was a theological dispute. So the reformers are going to be heavily critical on this idea of marriage as a sacramental act. They want to believe that marriage is more about the estate. The first person I would turn to here is Erasmus of Rotterdam, dies 1536. Now, he does believe that marriage is a sacrament, but he wants to deny that Ephesians 5 is a proof text. He's one of the first ones that I'm aware of that really begins to go after this medieval usage of Ephesians 5. See his annotations in the Textus Receptus for this. And he's really going to he's going to really going to hammer home this idea of marriage as an estate. And also that it's a higher calling than that of celibacy. So he's sort of turning against Augustine at this point. And then he also denies the indissolubility of marriage. So you can see, if Erasmus is kind of like it's got the chisel and he's hammering away at it a little bit, we all know that everybody wants to just kind of crack open Pandora's box, but the reality of Pandora's box is that there's actually no power in the box. The power is in the insatiable appetite man has for pride of place. And I think a little humility would have helped all of these men, which leads us right to Martin Luther. And where Erasmus has a little bit of hesitancy about these things, though he does, start to challenge, some of the methodological approaches to how we interpret tradition, thereby, really kind of undermining the legitimacy of any development up to that point. Luther just takes it a step further and declares that tradition itself is a fallible authority. And then he then proceeds to give his own definition of what a sacrament is, which automatically excludes marriage and holy orders. He was unsure about penance, but he eventually drops that from the list as well. So by changing the definition, I say that Luther, in a sense, it's kind of a controversial take that I have, but I think it holds. He kind of anticipates the modernist heresy because he's going to appeal to antiquity to mold the terms to fit the definitions that he already has preconceived, regardless of whether antiquity actually held to those or not. But the whole idea is that, we're gonna move away from the precision of the developments that have taken place in the meantime. We're gonna go back to this earlier primitive state so that I can go back and apply my definitions and the precision that I want these terms to have. So when he goes back and he's looking at verbum et elementum of the terminology from Augustine, he uses Augustine's terminology, he uses Augustine's definition, but he changes what verbum and elementum mean so that when he is finished with his sacramentology, only baptism and the Eucharist end up surviving. He also says that celibacy is a higher calling, but fewer called, and that as well marriage is an estate, which is largely a matter of civil society and not the church. So, for as far as Luther's concerned, he does want to say that there is a primordial good and a perennial good to marriage, but whether it's, a civil institution or an ecclesial institution, he kind of straddles that fence a little bit. And marriage as an estate, and the key to the whole thing of this thing of marriage as an estate is you're thinking about probably, excuse me, what many of you think of when you think of marriage, where you're thinking of marriage as this thing that you're participating in over time with your spouse, where this is not what the debate's around. The debate is around marriage as a act in time versus that marriage as this thing that you're involved in through a period of time. So the Protestants basically want to say that marriage as an estate is this condition that you're living in when you join with this spouse that lasts over, whether it's divorce. Luther, he seems to have held that divorce was a grave evil and a really bad thing. Whether or not he thought it was totally indissoluble, I think is clearly disputed. But he does want to say that it's something that should be a lifetime thing. But the idea is that marriage as an estate is this thing that takes place over a period of time. And they really have a problem with this, like what they see as the scholastics, the high Middle Ages emphasis on the like getting to the intricacies of marriage as an act that takes place specifically, if you think about like bring to mind a modern Catholic marriage. It's going to be in a church. It's going to be at a mass. It's going to have a minister involved. There's going to be the exchange of vows Like these things are very like specific to the act that takes place. And so that's what everybody's debating about in the Middle Ages, where the Protestants want to come along and say, "Hey, we're not worried about any of that. We don't care about any of that. None of that matters. It's not even really one of the sacraments anyways. So you're really chasing windmills when you guys are arguing over that. Marriage is this estate. It's largely a civil matter. It's largely about the good of society and not the church." This is actually one of the things that Thomas talks about quite a bit in his what I didn't really get into when Thomas talks about the good of marriage as for the good of the church as well too. He's drawing back from to Augustine there, but that's kind of the emphasis that the Protestants want to place on it, where the Catholic Church believes that marriage as a one of the seven sacraments, that there is a sacramental act that takes place in time that we have to be precise about in terms of making sure that the sacrament is validly ministered and or excuse me administered. So was there a consensus on matrimony by the time of Luther? I answered this yesterday. I say yes. My opinion when I put on my historical lens, what typically ends up happening is that events of time end up forcing the church to play her hand. This is why I said, once you get to that definition of the first canon of matrimony of Tometzi and the canons of Trent, once you get to that, it looks like it's a big leap, but it's kind of where the Reformation has forced the conversation to. Things are sort of naturally progressing over a period of centuries, and then boom, you get, the canons of Trent drop because the reformers kind of say, "Hey, we're willing to anathematize over this. We're willing to be cast out from the church over these issues." So Trent says, "Okay, well, we're going to give you what the conditions are to be in the church." So, what may have taken centuries to unpack because of the Reformation, because of Luther going against the opinion of all of the theologians for the last 400 years up to his lifetime, Trent provides the church with the answer, settles the dispute to the degree that it speaks authoritatively on the topic, and I think that's kind of where we're left with. I think Catholics can acknowledge some of the difficulties and the seemingly haphazard ways that the tradition comes down to us. Church history, look, it's a tough discipline to master. This is why going all the way back to the beginning, I was making such a emphasis on the videos that I was doing. This is actually, I think, what kind of compelled Kevin to reach out to me to kind of have this discussion was because, I think you have to have a clear understanding of development in order to make sense of the history and the tradition as they're handed down to us. And once you have that, you're able to follow something like the development of marriage as a sacrament through the centuries. You can honestly, like, a lot of Catholics, they really struggle with the High Middle Ages. They want to like laud the High Middle Ages, like sort of in the distance, that the grand cathedrals and the crusades and the Summa Theologia, like these things are safe from a distance, but we don't want to get too close to any of it. We don't actually like want to have to deal with some of the like challenges that are thrown up at us. And I don't think that the challenges are as hard as people make them out to be. I think that with the Protestants specifically, they completely lobbed off the previous centuries, and in the process of doing that, I think that they've actually turned the church back to square one because there was nothing in the tradition of the church, and this is one of the major Achilles heels of the Protestant Reformation. I think the other major Achilles heels is going to be sola scriptura, but that's another conversation. But besides sola scriptura, the other Achilles heel is they're nowhere in the conversation for those 500 years. The arguments that Luther's making, the arguments that Chemnitz and Calvin and these people are making later, you don't find those arguments for the 500 years that these arguments are happening. So basically, they're saying is we've got to erase those centuries. We've got to go back to some other primitive antiquarian time and revisit everything all over again, where there's nothing in the church that sets a precedence for that. Like you have to basically completely redo the methodology of the church. You have to completely redo the epistemological aspects of the church. And then you have to completely redo, once you're finished with all that, you're going to have a completely different ecclesiology. So that's why I think that this is a major problem. And not only that, marriages were taking place all throughout this time. And as the theologians were catching up with it, I think on a ground level, the priests, the couples, they were already well aware. They probably may not have been able to articulate it to you, but most of your married couples in the Catholic Church, long before Trent, long before the Council of Florence or Second Leon's, would have been able to express to you that there's something good, holy, and sacramental about the institution of marriage, and that it is it's truly and properly a sacrament of the Church which confers grace. So, anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. Please go watch the video. Again, a special thank you to Kevin Fernandez for reaching out to me. A special thank you to Christian Wagner for allowing us to have that conversation. I hope this further elaborates on the topic. It's one that I'm super fascinated in. And, Christian began the conversation by saying these are the kind of conversations that we need to be having as Catholics. We need to kind of get away sometimes. It's not that the papacy is not interesting. Papacy is super interesting. It's super important. But we need to have these things as well too, that just sort of languish in obscurity, but that are also very important to helping Catholics grow in holiness. God bless you all. Take care.